So there's this red button, blue button debate. It's been around on the internet before, but it was recently posed by Tim Urban of Wait But Why on Twitter. And it goes as follows. Everyone in the world has to take a private vote by pressing a red or blue button. If more than 50% of people press the blue button, everyone survives. If less than 50% of people press the blue button, only people who press the red button survive. Which button would you press? A poll is conducted. You press red, you press blue. You press blue and everyone survives if a majority cooperates, or you press red and guarantee your own survival, but obviously risk collective disaster. Although the red button pressers don't seem to recognize that risk, but we'll get to that. So this large-scale coordination dilemma has been posed across social media platforms. I'm no longer on Twitter, but I've seen it on the other social media platforms, and everywhere that I have seen it, blue has won. The blue button pressers have won the vote. I even did a private poll of my own, which kind of had me looking sideways to some of the people who pressed the red button. But in every case that I've seen, even in my own case, the blue button pressers won. In fact, the closest results I saw between the blue button pressers and the red button pressers was in the original Twitter screenshot itself, where blue was at 57.9% and red was at 42.1%. But everywhere else, I saw that blue was winning by like an overwhelming margin. I also saw a chart that compared how red voters and blue voters saw themselves and the other side in a Jack Saint video, actually. So red voters see themselves as realistic, prudent, not dying for strangers, prepared for betrayal, high IQ, whatever. And red voters see blue voters as naive, sentimental, gambling with survival, hoping trust will save them. On the contrary, blue voters see themselves as cooperative, courageous, keeping the social fabric alive, and betting on trust, whereas blue voters see red voters as self-protective, cynical, willing to defect, and choosing survival over solidarity. So, in case you didn't guess already, I would pick blue, but let me first explain why I wouldn't pick red. On the outset, I want to say that I have read the arguments on both sides and I understand why people would pick red. I may be looking at them sideways, but I understand some of the arguments and justifications. I'm not calling you a bad person. It's just that some red button pressers say things like, oh, it's just game theory, or nobody has to die, everybody has the same choice, why are you pressing any other button but the you will live button? People who press blue are stupid. Which I think a lot of the responses I'm seeing from the people who are defending the red button pressing choice, and to some extent the blue button pressing choice as well, but more so the red button pressing choice, is a lack of theory of mind. So theory of mind is the cognitive ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, desires, emotions, and intentions to oneself and others, recognizing that others have perspectives different from one's own. So if you are making statements like this, no reason to press blue, I can't see how blue pressers would press blue, blue pressers had to be stupid to press blue. Like, no, you're just demonstrating that you lack the ability to recognize other people's thought processes. People who press the blue button, generally speaking, are empathetic people who realize that it is impossible for everyone to press the red button. Okay? You can't just say, oh, if everyone would just press the red button, everything will be fine. That's not how it works. First of all, look at the debate that's happening on social media, and it should be clear that there is no 100% in anything. And you could say, oh, it's the only smart choice. Just press red and survive. That's it. It doesn't matter. 100% of people are not gonna pick red, and 100% of people are not gonna pick blue. So the two outcomes available are not 100% red, 100% blue, majority blue, or majority red. The two outcomes are majority red and majority blue. Majority blue is clearly preferable to majority red, and that is a preference based on both collective interest, but also self-interest. Because a red victory would mean that everyone else dies. At minimum, millions of people. Even if only 1% of the population voted blue, that's still millions of people. But more than 1% of the population is going to be voting for blue. So you're most likely going to see the death of billions of people. if red wins. And I've seen people reframing the question in all kinds of ways to try and get a particular response. And that is the power of survey questions, right? You can ask a question in a particular way to get the kind of answer that you're after. So you could reframe it as, oh, you either press the you might die button or you press the you always live button. But I think this is a failure to recognize the social nature of the problem entirely to focus on an individual decision. Thinking of the scenario as a purely individual decision between two buttons is precisely what I think allows people to reframe the scenario as something so straightforward. I've also seen people frame it as, oh, there's a blue button in front of you, and if you don't press it, nothing happens, but if you press it, you die unless another 4 billion people press it. The problem being, of course, that nothing happens is not the red button outcome. The red button outcome is, if enough people press this red button, all the ones who didn't will die. The blue button outcome is, if enough people press this blue button, everyone will live. Because again, it is not about your individual decision to press the button or not press the button. It is about the collective outcome of all of individual decisions. And if you cannot place your individual decision in the context of the collective, then I think you're missing the forest for the trees. There is one kind of reframing that I do consider somewhat interesting to engage with, which is the reframing of the question that focuses on the percentage. Like if you change the threshold of how many people had to vote for blue, then you might see different outcomes. So you could say 50%, but what if 99% of people had to vote for blue for everyone to live? Then I think in that scenario, you would most likely see most people, if not everyone, voting for red. However, the same could be said that if the threshold was 10% or 15% or 5%, that a lot of red voters might possibly switch to vote for blue. Still, I want to return to the self-preservation argument that the red button voters make. I think it's a very limited and short-sighted notion of self-preservation that demonstrates a lack of long-term thinking. Because let's say the scenario did play out, who is going to want to live in a red button victory world? Who wants to live in such an extremely low-trust society? Who wants to live in a world where the most empathetic people, which maybe you think is just a virtue signal for them, but where the most empathetic people can be eliminated and expect the world to be a better place? Or really just to eliminate any large chunk of people, to eliminate any people and expect the world to be better off for it? To eliminate an entire chunk of the population and not have the economy, the supply chains that you, with your individual self-interest, relies upon to not collapse instantaneously. A red victory is literally a danger to not just your self-interest, but the interest of the entire collective, in the interest of all of humanity. It can look like self-preservation in the short term, sure, I acknowledge that. But when you think about the consequences is total collapse and potentially a long, slow mass death in the long term. I would not want to live in a red button world because I think the mindset that decision engenders, not to say that it applies to all people who pressed the red button, but to many that did. I think the mindset that decision engenders being the new default, being the default, would be totally unappealing to me. What I am interested in learning though is what proportion of the only child population is red button voters versus blue button voters. But kicks aside though, I think the debate kind of exposes the faults in democracy, right? So stepping outside of its parameters for a second, the majoritarian inclination of it is obvious. You know, in democracy, every decision produces winners and losers. And in this scenario, a blue majority wins and everyone lives. A red majority wins and everyone else dies. And so we see that minorities are basically powerless while conforming to the majority. In the case of a red win, the blue minority is literally annihilated. And nothing happens to a red minority in the blue win scenario, but still. So this binary reflects to me the narrowness of democratic processes. We see by parody, essentially, the reduction of human complexity through a literal reduction in the human population due to one particular outcome. And the way that this whole scenario, as dialogue has gone on, I really think that you see a mirror of the social psychological costs of democracy as a process. You see distrust and anxiety around voting correctly as our mechanism of cooperation is funneled into the democratic process. We see the resultant polarization. We see how people entrench themselves into their antagonistic, mutually opposing positions. And you also see from this whole scenario a kind of pedagogy of obedience. Of course, it's a hypothetical scenario, and when you're posing hypotheticals, you tend to engage with and accept the parameters of the hypothetical. But I think it still, to some extent, demonstrates how this ritual of voting, in this case through button pressing, conditions people to accept outcomes that they may otherwise oppose. This gamble that the whole scenario puts forward is not even thought to be possible to oppose. You know, I haven't seen anyone, because again, it is a hypothetical, but stick with me. I haven't seen anyone ask the question, what if we just decide not to vote? Or what if we confront the system or the entity that is forcing this vote in the first place? But I understand it's a hypothetical, so put that aside. We see in democratic processes, though, that there's a reinforcement of compliance, a conditioning of compliance, even when compliance results in harm, because the process, the structure, the system takes precedence. It embodies authority. As an anarchist, I don't see freedom resulting through the binding procedures of democracy. Now, I've written a bit about coordination without hierarchy on my blog before, and I've spoken about my thoughts on anarchy at length on my main channel. And I talk about the role of free association and decentralized coordination and freedom of dissociation. But I'll save articulating my full stance on democracy for a future main channel video. Hope you all enjoyed this one. These are just some of my thoughts on the ongoing debate.